Hello everybody, today I would like to talk to you about my budget mono blue Merfolk Control deck. It is interesting for two different reasons. The first reason is that this is a nostalgic deck for me because this is the very first deck I was playing when I only started playing old school. Even before I understood that old school is the path that I'm going to choose for Magic in the future, I decided to get a mono blue Merfolk deck with some control elements, and I played this deck against my friends who were playing what we call kitchen table Magic and some modern and some different formats. So I started experimenting with that, and then I understood that this is the way to go. I later on sold all of my modern cards, all of my modern staples. I sold my legacy staples, and I decided to get into old school 100%. This was back in summer 2017. So this is an incredibly important deck for me. Also, this deck is important because I participated in the tournament organized by Timmy the Sorcerer himself. He organized this Lord of Jank tournament where we had to build decks on the budget of 200 euros, I think, not dollars. And each individual card could not cost more than 20 euros in its cheapest reprint. So that's what I did. I didn't actually construct this deck specifically for the tournament. I just decided to remember what cards I had. I had no power cards. I had no powerful cards like, for instance, Mana Drain. So this is what I started playing with, and this is what I'm really happy about, revisiting this deck. So let me just talk about the deck itself. We've got a lot of lands. We've got 1, 2, 3... 23 islands. 23 islands because we really need a lot of mana. We need to be able to cast some threats. We need to be able to keep some mana for counter spells. Also, we have more mana. We want to have more mana than our opponent for spell blasts, power sinks. So that's why you have a ton of mana here. There are 4 Mishras that I do not typically count as one land. They are maybe half of a land because very often you will be using it as a creature. And Mishras were incredibly powerful in this particular deck because we have got clones. We have got Dance of Many, so sometimes I was able to assemble an army of Mishras. I think there were maybe 6 Mishras that I was controlling, or maybe 5 Mishras at one point, and it definitely won me some games. Then we have got 1 Strip Mine, because this is a Swedish deck, as you have already understood. We've got 1 Soul Ring, still fits within the budget. And then we have got the utility cards. I have got 2 Jellum Tome and 1 Big Book Jam the Tome. Very often I did not have enough mana to cast Jam the Tome and be able to use it consistently, so this is why Jellum Tome is a card I really like. Once again, you see, they are not really the weaker and the more powerful version, they're just different cards for different occasions. And then we have got, let's talk about Merfolk themselves. There aren't many Merfolk, because you understand that in Swedish rules, under Swedish rules, you cannot have access to Fallen Empires, which means that you will only have Lord of Atlantis. Incredibly powerful, very often my clone target, or can be used with Vesuvian Doppelganger and so on and so forth, to overrun your opponents. This is incredibly good. I have already talked about them in my video where I was discussing old school tribes. So Lord of Atlantis is definitely the best lord in old school. Only 2 mana for 2/2, and also gains the most important land walk, which is Island Walk, because as you know, Island is the most powerful basic land in old school Magic. And maybe not only old school. However, I have got 2 Merfolk Assassin. Sadly, I did not manage to find any place, any slots for War Barge, but I did play War Barge back in the day. This time I just decided not to include it. It's a really fun card. This is 1/2, it will be 2/3 with Pump, maybe from Sunken City or Lord of Atlantis. Still not a perfect Merfolk. And certainly I did not include the 1/1 Merfolk of Pearl Trident because I feel that it just eats up a slot and does not contribute to anything. Of course, I could have included a bit more Merfolk. I could have gone for a more aggro version of this, but I decided to make it a little bit more control-ish. And speaking of control, we have got Control Magic. Control Magic is a card that I absolutely love. I know that my opponents hate it. I personally don't feel bad when my opponents cast Control Magic. my creatures, because I kind of expect that, but this can be a little bit unexpected if you are playing this main board as I'm doing right now. There are also 2 more in the sideboard, as you will see later on. Now we have got control elements such as counterspell, and we also have 4 spell blasts. I am a fan of spell blast because spell blast very often is just better than power sync. I feel that this is a hard counter. In playing old school Magic, very often our opponent will have a ton of mana, and it's not necessary that you will have more mana than your opponent. So I feel that, yes, this is an incredibly important card. You cannot counter your opponent's threats sometimes if they have mana acceleration or so. But for threats, for instance, we may have control magic, we may have Nevinyrral's Disc, or even Steel Artifact. So my rationale is like that. First, we include Mana Drain, not in this deck because this is a budget deck. Then we include a playset of counter spells. Then we start including some niche counter spells such as Spell Blast, then probably Power Sync, then maybe Flash Counter. Haven't actually used it, but could be a good idea depending on the deck you are playing. Then we have got 2 copies of Sunken City. Well, Sunken City, as you understand, is just a Bad Moon or a Crusade, but it has this drawback. So this is the famous blue tax, if you wish, because for playing blue you really have to pay more if you want to deal with creatures. So that again brings me to the argument that it is surprising that Lord of Atlantis only has 2 blue as the mana cost, because for instance the Goblin King, as you understand, whereas red creatures are usually cheaper and more efficient than blue creatures, still you have to pay 3 for roughly the same effect. So yeah, Sunken City, yeah, it's a nice card. 2 mana, not optimal really, especially because sometimes I would have Dance of Many, so paying 4 mana during your upkeep, not something that I could always do. But let's talk about Dance of Many itself. You know probably how much I love this card. It allows me to copy my opponent's creature or my own Lord of Atlantis, for instance, or my own Mishra, which was a case very often. And it allowed me to do that, and later on I was able to still have some mana for counterspell. So unlike Clone, which I would cast and then I would have to invest 4 mana at once, I would be able to maybe have a couple of mana for counterspell. So Dance of Many is a card I definitely like as an addition to Clone. Clones, I had 3 of them. Cannot say that they were incredibly useful. Unfortunately, you see that I invested a lot of slots into dealing with creature-based decks, and I did see some creature-based decks. Actually, most of the decks that I saw were aggro decks with low mana curve. But the problem is that they were actually not mid-range decks, most of them. So that's why sometimes using 4 mana to just clone your opponent's Curd Ape, for instance, or some small creature is really not optimal. This might be one of the reasons that I didn't do too good. They were actually no perfect matchups for me. Then we've got Doppelganger. You know, it's interesting versatile ability, cloning at will, so to say, cloning on demand during your upkeep. A really good card. Then we have got Steel Artifact. We have got 2 copies of Steel Artifact. There were some incredibly interesting games with Timmy himself, where Timmy cast Nevinyrral's Disc. I had my own Nevinyrral's Disc. It was the battle of discs. Sometimes I would steal the disc. It's a matter of activating the disc. So, and there were games that were basically restarted. It's almost like Scheherazade, so a game within a game, and some incredibly interesting interactions. And this brings me to this idea that budget magic can still be powerful. Once again, I'm a big proponent of saying that in old school Magic you can have good and consistent result on a budget. Of course, you shouldn't expect to be always better. You shouldn't expect to have a higher probability rate of winning than people who play power. That would be silly. But in general, the difference is not that great. Its difference is not that great. And remember, Magic is a game of luck in many ways still. Not only luck in terms of what you draw, but also luck in terms of what matchups you get. Some matchups are just hopeless for you, even if you have an incredibly high power, high tier deck. with inexpensive cards. So there are 3 Psy Blasts. Psy Blasts were powerful, they were really good very often, so this is a card I do not regret putting into my main board. Then we have got one more Steel Artifact, which I would sometimes use, but sometimes I sided it out. Because again, you see there are no mocks and there is no other powerful artifacts that are typical of some high-powered decks and so on and so forth. Then we've got Phantasmal Terrains, which I probably should have used more because I didn't use them on my opponent's Mishras. 2 power sinks that I have already discussed. Nevinyrral's Discs try to compensate for the weakness of the blue color and that it cannot properly deal with artifacts and enchantments. Yes, sure, of course you have got Steel Artifact, but what if this artifact is symmetric? This doesn't really change anything. So, yes, Nevinyrral's Disc. The biggest issue is that it comes into play tapped, of course. I have seen some people who use Twiddle in their deck in order to be able to untap the disc right away and use it just after they cast it. So, yeah, this is one of the biggest disadvantages of this deck, and this is why blue and white control is so powerful. You really need this white splash to be able to deal with permanents efficiently. You need Disenchant, you need Swords to Plowshares. There are 2 more Control Magic, and there are 3 copies of Energy Flux. So that is it. Once again, I want to thank Timmy for organizing this event. It was a really nice and fun event. I met some people I have not been able to see before in Facebook old school groups. So once again, thank you. And there are plenty of different varieties of old school, such as budget, old school magic, and some other interesting limitations that we can explore. You know, it's not really limited to Swedish, Atlantic, and DC, even though these are good formats on their own. Thank you for watching, and bye.